Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romantic stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. If soft, heartfelt tales help you unwind, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of calm. Now, let's begin tonight's story. The Woman at Walheim. The Austrian hamlet of Walheim slept under a sky the colour of washed-out linen. A quiet corner of the world tucked away in the rolling green hills of the Salzkammergut. It was the early autumn of 1922, and though the Great War had been over for 4 years, its ghost still lingered in the crisp mountain air, a palpable presence in the silence that had settled over the valley. Here, the pastoral beauty of the landscape with its gentle slopes and tidy farms offered a stark, almost cruel contrast to the emotional scars that ran deep in the hearts of its people. The atmosphere was one of quiet melancholy, of a world slowly, painstakingly learning to heal, a sentiment that echoed the gentle yet profound emotional depth of a Gaskell novel. Viktor had come to Walheim seeking anonymity, a place where the ghosts of the trenches might finally be laid to rest. He was a man hollowed out by the war, his youth and laughter buried somewhere in the mud and blood of the Italian front. Now, in his late 20s, his face was a mask of quiet observation, his eyes, the colour of a stormy sky, holding a profound sadness that he kept carefully guarded. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his body honed by years of hard labour, but his hands, though strong and capable, would sometimes tremble with the memory of things he would not voice. He sought solace in the grounding, repetitive work of the farm, the steady rhythm of the scythe, the warmth of the animals, the solid feel of the earth beneath his boots. Greta, on the other hand, was as rooted to the land as the ancient pear tree that stood in the centre of her family's farm. She was a woman of 25, though the weight of responsibility had etched fine lines around her eyes and mouth, making her appear older. With her parents gone, she managed the small farm with a quiet determination, caring for her 2 younger siblings, Lena and Jacob, with a fierce protective love. She was the resilient heart of her small world, a woman of immense strength and quiet grace. But her heart was bound by a solemn promise, a vow made in the first flush of youth to her childhood fiancé, Franz, who was presumed to have died in the war. The memory of him was a constant bittersweet ache, a ghost she had learned to live with, a silent companion in her solitary life. Viktor arrived at Greta's farm on a cool September morning, the mist still clinging to the valley floor. He had heard in the village that she was in need of a farmhand, and he had come offering his services. Greta, standing in the doorway of the farmhouse, her hands wrapped in her apron, studied him with a steady, appraising gaze. She saw the weariness in his eyes, the way he held himself as if braced for a blow, and in that moment she recognised a fellow survivor, a soul as scarred as her own. She hired him without asking for references, a decision guided by an instinct she could not explain. Viktor proved to be a good worker, his silence a welcome respite from the well-meaning but often intrusive chatter of the villagers. He moved with a quiet competence, his hands sure and steady as he mended fences, chopped wood, and tended to the animals. He and Greta fell into a comfortable rhythm, their days measured by the cycles of the land, their communication often consisting of no more than a shared glance, a nod of understanding. But in the quiet evenings, after the children were asleep and the chores were done, a fragile bond began to form between them. Their first real connection, the first spark of something more than just shared labour, came on a quiet evening in the late October. A storm had blown in from the mountains, the wind howling through the valley, rattling the windows of the old farmhouse. One of the horses, a young mare named Liesel, had become spooked by the storm, her frantic whinnies echoing from the barn. Greta, her face pale with worry, had gone out to calm the animal, but Liesel, her eyes wide with fear, would not be soothed. Viktor, seeing her struggle, had followed her out into the storm. He said nothing, simply moved past her into the stall, his presence calm and reassuring. He began to speak to the horse in a low, gentle voice, his words a soft murmur against the roar of the wind. He reached out a hand, not to touch the mare, but to simply let her know he was there. Slowly Liesel's trembling subsided, her whinnies softening to a low nicker. Viktor continued to speak to her, his voice a steady, comforting presence in the darkness, until finally the mare was calm. When he turned to leave the stall, he found Greta standing there watching him, her eyes shining in the lantern light. In that moment, she saw something more than just a quiet farmhand. She saw a man of profound gentleness, a man who understood the language of fear and suffering, a man who knew to soothe a troubled soul. He met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw a flicker of something she had not seen before, a vulnerability, a longing that mirrored her own. An unspoken understanding of shared loss and weariness passed between them, a fragile, invisible thread that bound them together in the storm-tossed night. From that night on, the silence between them was no longer empty, but filled with a new, unspoken awareness. It was in the way his hand brushed against hers as they passed in the narrow hallway, the way his eyes would follow her as she moved about the kitchen, the way she would find herself listening for the sound of his footsteps, her heart giving a little flutter when she heard him approaching. The air between them was charged with a slow-burning tension, a quiet, insistent longing that was as undeniable as the changing of the seasons. They were two lonely souls, two people who had thought their lives were already written, their futures set in stone. But in the tranquil, isolated beauty of Walheim, amidst the lingering shadows of the past, a new and unexpected love was beginning to take root, a fragile blossom in the autumn of their lives. It was a love born of shared sorrow and quiet understanding, a love that held the promise of healing, of finding peace in a world that had been shattered by war. And as the days grew shorter and the nights grew longer, as the first snows of winter began to dust the mountain peaks, Viktor and Greta found themselves on the cusp of a journey they had never expected to take, a journey into the uncharted territory of the heart. The passing of autumn into the quiet heart of winter brought with it a deepening intimacy between Viktor and Greta. The raw, unsettled energy that had first defined their interactions mellowed into a steady, comforting rhythm, as reliable as the rising and setting of the pale winter sun. Their days were a shared narrative written in the language of the land, the sharp ring of the axe on wood, the soft lowing of cattle in the barn, the companionable silence of two people working side by side, their movements synchronized by a mutual understanding that transcended words. Viktor's quiet competence became the scaffolding upon which Greta leaned, a steadying presence that eased the burden she had carried alone for so long. He began to speak, not in a torrent, but in fragments, like shards of a broken mirror reflecting a past he was slowly learning to piece back together. He never spoke of the horror, the deafening roar of artillery or the screams of the dying. Instead, he shared the strange, quiet moments of humanity he had witnessed between battles. He told her of a German soldier who had risked his life to save a stray dog trapped in no man's land, of the shared Christmas truce when enemies had sung carols to one another across the frozen mud, of the simple, profound beauty of a single poppy growing amidst the devastation. In these stories, Greta saw not the soldier, but the man, a man who had clung to his humanity in the face of unspeakable brutality. In turn, Greta found herself opening up to him in a way she never had with anyone else. She spoke of Franz, not as the ghost that stood between them, but as the boy she had known, the boy who had dreamed of building a new barn and planting an orchard of apple trees. She spoke of her deep-rooted love for the land, a love that was both her inheritance and her burden, of her hopes and fears for her younger siblings, of the quiet, lonely ache that had been her constant companion for so many years. In Viktor's quiet, attentive presence, she felt seen, understood, as if the carefully constructed walls around her heart were beginning finally to crumble. One cold, wind-swept afternoon, while clearing out a small, disused shed, Viktor came across a small wooden box. Inside, nestled amongst some old tools, was a half-finished wood carving of a bird, a kestrel with its wings half spread, its form still rough and unrefined. He knew without asking that it had been Franz's. He had seen the same patient, deliberate marks in the way Franz had repaired a broken gate, the same careful attention to detail in the sturdy construction of the old chicken coop. He took the carving back to his small room in the attic, and in the quiet hours of the evening, by the flickering light of a single candle, he began to work. His hands, which had once held a rifle, now held a small sharp knife. He worked slowly, painstakingly, his touch both firm and gentle. He was not trying to erase Franz, to replace him, but rather to honour him, to finish what had been left undone. It was an act of reverence, a way of acknowledging the ghost that stood between them, of giving it a form, a tangible presence. He worked on the carving for weeks, each delicate shaving a prayer, each smooth curve a silent promise. He finished it on the eve of the winter solstice. The kestrel was now a thing of beauty, its wings poised for flight, its feathers so finely detailed they seemed almost real. He found Greta in the kitchen, her hands deep in a bowl of dough, her brow furrowed in concentration. He said nothing, simply placed the finished carving on the table in front of her. She looked up, her eyes widening in surprise. She reached out a flour-dusted hand and gently touched the bird's wing. The moment was thick with unspoken emotion, a sound so profound it seemed to hum in the air between them. In that small wooden bird she saw not just the memory of the boy she had lost, but the presence of the man who had found her. It was a mutual acknowledgement of the past that haunted them and the future that was beginning, tentatively, to bloom. A single tear traced a path through the flower on her cheek, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were filled with a gratitude so deep it left her breathless. The turning point came during the village's annual Winterfest. The day had been bright and cold, the air filled with the sounds of laughter and music, the scent of roasting chestnuts and mulled wine. For the first time in years, Greta felt a lightness in her heart, a sense of hope that was as intoxicating as the spiced wine she sipped. She watched Viktor as he effortlessly lifted young Jakob onto his shoulders so he could see the puppet show, a rare, genuine smile gracing his lips. In that moment her heart gave a lurch, a sudden, fierce recognition of a feeling she had long thought buried. They returned to the farm as evening fell, the laughter of the village fading behind them. The warmth of the day had vanished, and the wind was beginning to bite. Inside the farmhouse, a cheerful fire was crackling, and Lena and Jakob were chattering excitedly about the festival. As Greta helped them out of their coats, she glanced out the window. The sky overhead had deepened to a bruised purple, and the first flakes of snow were beginning to drift down. "A storm is coming," she said, her voice quiet. "Viktor, would you help me check on the animals? I want to make sure the barn is secure." He nodded, and they pulled their coats back on, leaving the warm, noisy kitchen for the biting cold outside. The wind was stronger now, howling down from the mountains and whipping the snow into a frenzy. They hurried across the yard to the barn, the heavy wooden door groaning in protest as they pushed it open and slipped inside. They were plunged into a sudden, muffled silence. The only sounds were the roar of the wind outside and the soft, contented rustling of the animals in their stalls. A single lantern cast a warm, golden circle of light in the vast, shadowed space. The air was thick with the familiar, comforting scent of hay and animals and cold stone. They stood for a moment, breathless and dusted with snow, the world outside entirely shut away, leaving only this intimate, protected space. "That came on fast," Greta said, her voice softer than she intended. Viktor nodded, his eyes fixed on her. The lantern light caught the snowflakes melting in her hair, turning them into tiny glistening jewels. He reached out, his movements slow, deliberate, and brushed a flake from her temple. His fingers, rough from work but surprisingly gentle, lingered for a fraction of a second against her skin. It was a touch that changed everything. The air between them, already charged, became electric. The silence was no longer empty but filled with the deafening beat of their own hearts. He did not move his hand away, but let it cup her jaw, his thumb stroking softly along her cheekbone. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed, a soft sigh escaping her lips. He lowered his head, his gaze intense, searching hers for a sign, a signal. She gave it to him, rising slightly on her toes, her body swaying towards his. Their lips were a breath apart, the promise of a kiss, of a release from the tension that had been building for months, hanging in the air. But at the last possible moment he hesitated. A shadow of conflict, of profound sorrow passed through his eyes. It was the ghost of Franz, the weight of his own honour, the deep respect he had for her loyalty to a memory. To kiss her now would be to steal something, and he was not a thief. He let his hand drop, taking a small, almost imperceptible step back. The spell was broken, but the unspoken thing between them was now undeniable. A living presence in the room. The ghost of that almost kiss was more powerful, more intimate than any touch. They stood in the charged silence, the storm raging outside, a pale imitation of the tempest within. The walk from the barn to the farmhouse was the longest of their lives, each step heavy with what had almost been, and what might now, impossibly, still be. The fragile peace of Walheim and of Greta's heart was shattered by the arrival of a letter. It came on a Tuesday morning, a day like any other, the sky a crisp, unforgiving blue. The postman, a cheerful, ruddy-faced man named Klaus, handed it to Greta with a smile, oblivious to the fact that he was delivering a ghost. The envelope was thin and worn, the handwriting unfamiliar, the postmark from a city in France she had never heard of. Her hands trembled as she opened it, a cold, sickening dread coiling in her stomach. The letter was not from Franz, but from a doctor at a military hospital. The words were simple, direct, devoid of emotion. Franz was alive. He had been a patient there for years, a man without a name, without a past, his mind and body shattered by the war. A recent breakthrough, a flicker of memory, a name whispered in a fevered dream, Greta, had led them to her. He was coming home, the world tilted on its axis. The solid, comforting reality of her life, the farm, the children, Viktor, dissolved into a dizzying, chaotic blur. Franz. Alive. The words were impossible, a cruel joke, a nightmare from which she could not wake. She stood in the middle of the kitchen, the letter clutched in her hand, the world around her silent and still. She felt nothing, a strange, hollow emptiness where her heart should have been. Viktor found her there minutes later, her face as white as the snow outside. He saw the letter in her hand, the look of stunned disbelief in her eyes, and he knew, with a terrible gut-wrenching certainty, that something had broken. She handed him the letter without a word, her eyes pleading with him to tell her it wasn't true, that it was all a terrible mistake. He read the words, his own heart turning to ice. He looked at her, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes held a universe of pain. Franz returned a week later. The man who stepped off the train at the small Walheim station was a stranger. He was thinner, his face gaunt, his eyes holding the haunted, vacant look of a man who has seen too much. He walked with a limp, his body a testament to the brutality of the war, but it was him, it was Franz. He looked at Greta, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a ghost of the smile she remembered, and he whispered her name. In that moment, Greta's world, the world she had built with Viktor, the world of quiet understanding and unspoken love, crumbled to dust. This was the man to whom she had promised herself, the man she had sworn to love, to honour, to wait for. How could she turn him away? How could she deny him the life that had been stolen from him? Viktor, a man of quiet, unshakable honour, understood. He saw the impossible choice she faced, the unbearable weight of her duty. He saw his own presence on the farm in her life as an intrusion, a complication she did not need. That evening, as the shadows lengthened and the cold deepened, he told her he was leaving. "He is your future, Greta," he said, his voice low and steady, betraying none of the turmoil in his heart. "I was just a visitor," Greta, overwhelmed by the shock of Franz's return, by the crushing weight of her own sense of duty, could not find the words to ask him to stay. She wanted to scream, to rail against the unfairness of it all, to tell him that he was not a visitor, that he was her home, but the words caught in her throat, strangled by a lifetime of promises, by the sad, lost look in Franz's eyes. Her silence was a blow to Viktor, a confirmation of his deepest fears. He misinterpreted it as relief, as her final unspoken choice. He saw in her silence not the agony of a torn heart, but the quiet acceptance of a woman returning to her rightful place. The days that followed were a living hell. The farmhouse, once a sanctuary of quiet comfort, was now a prison of unspoken words and simmering tensions. The air was thick with the ghosts of what might have been, with the palpable presence of a love that was now forbidden. Franz, though physically present, was emotionally absent, a hollow shell of the man he had once been. He would sit for hours by the fire, his eyes vacant, his mind lost in the labyrinth of his own broken memories. For Viktor, the fresh pain of this new loss was a trigger, a spark that ignited the smouldering embers of his own trauma. The nightmares returned, the trembling in his hands grew worse. The ghosts of the trenches once again his constant companions. He felt doomed to be a wanderer, a ghost himself, forever on the outside, never truly finding a place to belong. He had found a fragile peace in Walheim, in Greta, and now it was being ripped away from him, leaving him more broken, more lost than before. Greta watched him, her heart breaking with every tremor of his hand, every shadow that crossed his face. She was trapped, imprisoned by her own honour, torn between her duty to the broken man who had returned and her desperate, all-consuming love for the quiet man who was healing her. The pastoral beauty of Walheim, once a source of solace, now seemed to mock their pain, its quiet no longer peaceful but heavy with unspoken words and shattered hopes. She was watching the only true peace she had ever known, the only true love she had ever felt, pack his meagre belongings and prepare to walk away from her, and she was powerless to stop him. The silence in the house was a deafening roar, a testament to all the things they could not say, to the love that was being sacrificed on the altar of duty. The morning of Viktor's departure dawned cold and grey, the sky a leaden blanket that seemed to press down on the valley, suffocating all hope. He had packed his few belongings in a small worn canvas bag. He moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, each action a final, painful severance of the ties that bound him to this place, to her. Greta watched him from the kitchen window, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She had not slept, her mind a torment of unspoken words, of what-ifs and if-onlys. Franz was sitting by the fire, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, his eyes, for the first time since his return, clear and focused. He had not been blind. In the shared glances, the charged silences, the palpable tension that filled the house whenever Viktor and Greta were in the same room, he had seen the truth. He had seen the profound, unspoken love that existed between them, a love that was a living, breathing thing, a stark contrast to the faded, ghostly memory of what he and Greta had once shared. He turned to her, his voice quiet but firm. "You love him." It was not a question, but a statement of fact. Greta flinched, her eyes filling with tears. She could not deny it. She could not lie to this man who had already lost so much. "He is a good man," Franz continued, his gaze steady, his voice devoid of bitterness. "I have seen the way he looks at you. It is the way a man should look at the woman he loves. It is the way I used to look at you before. He gestured vaguely, a small helpless movement of his hand that encompassed the war, the hospital, the years of lost memories. He rose from his chair and came to stand before her, his hand still clutching the warm mug. "My war is over, Greta. I have come home, but I am not the same man who left. I don't think that man exists anymore. I want to find peace, not a prison. And you deserve to be happy. You deserve a love that is real, that is present, not a promise made to a ghost." He reached out and gently took her hand. "Go to him," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she could not name. Regret, resignation, a quiet, profound dignity. "You are released from your promise. Go." The words were a key, unlocking the cage of duty and honour in which she had been trapped. Freed from her obligation, she did not hesitate. She ran from the house, her feet flying over the frozen ground, her heart pounding in her chest. She found Viktor at the edge of the village, his bag slung over his shoulder, his back to her, about to walk out of her life forever. "Viktor!" she cried, her voice raw with desperation. He stopped, his shoulders tensing, but he did not turn around. She ran to him, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and stood before him, her face revealing everything she had been unable to say, her love, her pain, her desperate, all-consuming need for him. He turned then, and seeing her, really seeing her, the truth of her love reflected in her tear-streaked face, he understood. The dam of his carefully controlled emotion, the wall he had built around his heart to protect himself from further pain, finally be Greta, he whispered, his voice cracking. I thought I had to leave. I thought it was what you wanted." "No," she choked out, the single word a torrent of emotion. "No, I want you. Only you." He pulled her into his arms, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was not one of gentle longing, but of desperate, pent-up passion. It was a raw, explosive release of all the pain, the fear, the unspoken desire of the past months. It was the taste of salt and snow, of sorrow and salvation. It was a confirmation that their souls had long been intertwined, that they were two halves of a whole, two broken pieces that could only find wholeness in each other. He lifted her into his arms and carried her back towards the farm, his long strides eating up the ground, his purpose clear, his destination certain. He took her not to the house, but to the barn, to the hayloft where their love had almost been born. He laid her down in the soft, sweet-smelling hay, the scent of it a memory, a promise. The lantern cast a halo of gold around them, a sacred circle in the gloom, muffling the sound of the storm outside. What followed was a desperate healing fusion of two souls, an act that transcended lust to become a form of worship. His hands, no longer trembling, mapped the curves of her body through the coarse wool of her dress, his touch both a question and a claim. He found the buttons of her bodice, his fingers fumbling with an urgency that made her breath catch. The first touch of his warm palm against the cool skin of her collarbone was a shock, a brand. She arched into him, a soft, involuntary sound escaping her lips. He undressed her not slowly, but with a raw, reverent haste, his eyes never leaving hers. His gaze a testament to a love so profound it was almost painful. Her own hands were just as eager, pulling at his rough shirt, needing to feel the solid warmth of him. Her fingers traced the hard planes of his chest, the taut muscles of his stomach, and then, with a tenderness that made his eyes close, the raised, silvered scars on his back. Each one was a story she wanted to know, to heal with her touch, with her lips. Their coming together was a slow, deliberate act of surrender, a vulnerable, deeply emotional communion. It was the heat of skin against skin in the cold air, the whisper of breath, the scratch of hay, the silent, desperate prayer of two people who had been lost and had finally found their way home. He entered her with a reverence that shattered her, a joining that was less a taking and more a homecoming. She followed his lead without thought, her body finding his rhythm, their connection unfolding like a dance of pure, unadorned need. It was a release, a letting go of all the pain, the fear, the loneliness. In that hayloft, amidst the scent of hay and the quiet stillness of the winter morning, they found not just pleasure, but redemption. They found a sanctuary, a place where their brokenness could be made whole, where their scars could be seen not as marks of damage, but as proof of their survival. Viktor realized in that moment that love was not another battlefield to be lost, but a sanctuary to be cherished, a place of safety and healing. And Greta understood that true honour lay not in keeping a promise made to a ghost, but in embracing the living, breathing love that had saved her, that had brought her back to life. They were no longer two separate, lonely souls, but one, their hearts beating in unison, their futures finally, irrevocably intertwined. Viktor stayed. The decision was not a grand pronouncement, but a quiet, unspoken certainty that settled over the farm like the morning mist. His bag, once packed for departure, was unpacked, and its meagre contents returned to the small attic room that was now, finally, his home. Franz, with a quiet grace that spoke of a wisdom forged in the crucible of immense suffering, gave them his blessing. Walheim, he said, held too many ghosts for him, too many memories of a life that no longer felt like his own. He decided to move to Salzburg, to a larger town where he could build a new life for himself, a life unburdened by the past. He left not as a tragic figure, but as a man who had found a different kind of peace, a man who had chosen to let go of what was lost in order to make room for what might yet be found. With Franz's departure, a new, gentle quiet settled over the farm. The oppressive weight of unspoken words and unresolved tensions lifted, replaced by an easy, companionable silence. The daily work of the farm, once a solitary burden for Greta and a means of escape for Viktor, became a shared joy. They moved in a comfortable, familiar rhythm, their hands often brushing as they worked, their shared glances speaking volumes. The farm began to thrive under their combined care, the field seeming greener, the animals more content, the old farmhouse itself seeming to breathe a sigh of relief. The love between them was not a fiery, passionate blaze, but a steady, warm glow that illuminated every corner of their lives. It was in the way he would bring her a cup of coffee at dawn, his hand lingering on hers for a moment longer than necessary. It was in the way she would mend his worn work shirts, her stitches small and neat, each one a tiny declaration of her love. It was in the easy laughter they shared over the dinner table, in the comfortable silence they fell into as they sat by the fire in the evenings, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm wrapped securely around her. Months passed. Winter gave way to a tentative spring, the snow melting to reveal the rich, dark earth, the first green shoots pushing their way towards the sun. The world was waking up, being reborn, and with it so were they. The shadows in Viktor's eyes began to recede, replaced by a quiet contentment, a sense of peace he had never thought possible. The premature lines of worry on Greta's face softened, her smile now a frequent, radiant thing that lit up her whole being. One cool spring evening, as the setting sun cast a golden glow over the valley, Viktor sat on the front porch, a small block of wood and his carving knife in his hands. He worked with a quiet concentration. His hands, once a source of shame and a reminder of his trauma, now a source of creation, of beauty. He was no longer finishing someone else's work, but creating something entirely new, something born of his own heart. He presented it to her later that evening, as they sat together in the quiet twilight. It was a small, intricately detailed carving of a woman tending to a garden, her face turned towards the sun, a look of serene joy on her features. It was Greta. He had captured her strength, her resilience, her deep, abiding love for the land, all in that small piece of wood. She took the carving from him, her fingers tracing the delicate lines. She looked from the carving to him, her eyes full of a love so deep, so profound, it needed no words. He reached out and took her hand, no longer trembling, but strong and steady, and held it to his heart. They stood there for a long time, two silent figures silhouetted against the deepening twilight, looking out over the fields of Walheim. The air was filled with the sweet scent of damp earth and new blossoms, the sound of the evening birdsong a gentle symphony. The peace they had found was not the absence of scars, but the healing of them together. Their pasts had not been erased, but integrated into the fabric of their present, the threads of their individual sorrows woven together to create a tapestry of shared love, of mutual understanding, of profound, enduring joy. The melancholy had lifted from the valley, replaced by a quiet, hopeful hum, and on the small farm in the heart of Walheim, a love that had been born in the shadow of loss had finally gloriously come into full bloom, a testament to the resilience of the human heart, to the transformative power of a love that was both a sanctuary and a home. Ashes and wild roses. The wind in Montana had a voice. It was not the hurried, indifferent whisper of city air, but a deep, lonely sigh that swept down from the mountains and across the plains, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of a distant, clean rain. It was a sound that hollowed out the world, leaving a vast, intimidating space that mirrored the emptiness inside Donna. She stepped out of the hired car, her tailored blazer and sharp city trousers a jarring note against the wild, untamed landscape of the sprawling wildlife sanctuary. The fabric, meant for boardrooms and investor meetings, felt thin and useless against the sheer scale of the sky. At 32, Donna felt ancient. The empire she had built, an intricate architecture of code and algorithms, had vanished in a single catastrophic keystroke, market crash, a betrayal, a public humiliation. It had taken everything, including her engagement to Julian, her co-founder, and the man who had shared her ambition like a second skin. Now she was a refugee, fleeing the double wreckage of a life she no longer recognized. He was waiting for her on the porch of the main ranch house, a figure so perfectly a part of the landscape that he seemed carved from the same weathered wood as the building itself. Tristan was 38, but the lines around his eyes held the patience of a much older man, the kind of patience born from watching seasons turn and mountains stand unmoving. He didn't smile, but his greeting was polite, his gaze steady and reserved. He had seen volunteers like her before, idealists with haunted eyes, running from something sharp-edged and urban, who rarely lasted until the first snow. He showed her to a small, clean cabin, the air inside smelling of cedar and wood smoke. Her luggage, a set of sleek, hard-shelled cases, looked absurdly out of place on the rustic pine floor. She wanted to unpack, to create a semblance of order, but her hands felt useless, clumsy. I built an empire of code and it vanished in a keystroke, she thought, the words a bitter, silent refrain. What am I supposed to do with something so real, so broken? Her primary responsibility was a horse. Tristan led her to a far corral away from the other animals. The creature inside was a maelstrom of barely contained energy, a wounded mustang recently rescued and vibrating with a profound, wild mistrust. A jagged scar, pale and puckered against its dark coat, marred its flank like a brand. He was trapped in a barbed wire fence, Tristan said, his voice low and even. Took us 3 days to get him here. He's not ready for company. He simply called him the Mustang. Donna, looking at the fire that burned in the animal's dark, intelligent eyes, a fire that mirrored the ruin in her own soul, privately named him Ash. Her first attempts to connect with the horse were a disaster. She approached the fence with the same nervous, goal-oriented energy that had served her so well in securing venture capital. She held out a hand, her voice a low, placating murmur. Ash responded by rearing back, his nostrils flaring, his powerful body a tense sculpture of fear and defiance. He shied away from the frantic hum of her thoughts, the scent of her failure. Tristan watched from a distance, leaning against a fence post, his silence a more potent form of judgment than any words could have been. She felt it acutely, a familiar heat rising in her cheeks. After her third failed attempt, he walked over, his stride unhurried. "He knows you're in a hurry," he said, not unkindly. "Horses always know. You can't lie to them." Donna's hands clenched at her sides. In her world, speed was a virtue, a necessity. Patience was a luxury for those who could afford to wait. She had never been one of them. That evening, a brief, sharp shower swept across the plains, and the air filled with the clean, almost holy scent of wet sagebrush. Donna stood at the window of her cabin, watching the last light bleed from the sky. The metallic clang of the stable gate swinging shut in the wind echoed the sound of a door closing on her old life, a sound she had been hearing in her sleep for weeks. The vast, empty space of Montana didn't feel like freedom. It felt like a cage, bigger and more terrifying than the one she had left behind. Weeks bled into one another, marked not by deadlines and product launches, but by the slow, immutable rhythms of the sanctuary. The rising sun, the pre-dawn feedings, the long, quiet hours of labour. Donna shed her city skin layer by layer. The sharp angles of her posture softened. Her hands, once accustomed to the smooth, cool surface of a keyboard, became calloused and capable. The vastness of the landscape, once so intimidating, began to feel less like a void and more like a space to finally breathe. She changed her approach with Ash. Instead of trying to do something, to achieve a result, she simply began to be. She would bring a folding chair and a worn paperback into his enclosure, sit just inside the fence and read aloud. Her voice, at first hesitant, grew stronger as she lost herself in the familiar cadence of the printed word. She read Austen and Bronte, the measured, elegant prose a stark contrast to the wildness around them. For days the horse ignored her, standing at the far end of the corral, his scarred flank turned pointedly towards her. But gradually he began to watch her. His ears would swivel in her direction, his head lifting from its grazing. One afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long golden shadows across the plains, he took a single, deliberate step toward her, then another. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze fixed on her, his breathing a soft, rhythmic huff in the quiet air. Donna didn't move, didn't breathe. She just kept reading, her voice a low, steady murmur, a fragile thread of connection woven in the vast silence. Tristan found her there late one evening, long after her official duties were done. The sky was a deep velvet indigo, studded with an impossible number of stars, a universe away from the light-polluted skies of the city. She was just sitting with the horse, the book lying closed in her lap. Ash stood nearby, utterly calm, occasionally dropping his head to nudge her shoulder. Tristan didn't speak at first. He simply handed her a thick ceramic mug, the warmth seeping through into her cold hands. The coffee was strong and black, and it tasted of the fire it had been brewed over. This time he didn't retreat to a polite distance. He leaned against the fence beside her, his presence as solid and comforting as the ancient pines that dotted the landscape. It was their first real conversation. She spoke vaguely of her past, of a project that didn't work out, the words feeling flimsy and inadequate to describe the scale of her failure. He listened without judgment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Then he told her about the Mustang. "We found him after a wildfire swept through the basin last year. he said, his voice a low rumble. That scar on his flank, it's a burn. He was the only one of his herd that made it out. The fire took everything else. He paused, his eyes finding hers in the dim light. The land always comes back, though. After a fire, things grow back stronger. Different, but stronger. The quiet, rhythmic sound of Ash chewing hay in the nearby barn was the only sound for a long moment. Donna looked down at the coffee mug in her hands. Its simple, earthy warmth, a profound comfort. "In my world," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "if something breaks, you discard it and get a new one. You don't with it." "Out here," Tristan replied, his gaze returning to the vast star-dusted sky. "Nothing's ever really new. It's just a different version of what's always been. Scars are just part of the story." She looked up at the Milky Way, a brilliant, shimmering river of light that seemed to pour across the heavens. For the first time in months, the crushing weight in her chest seemed to lift, just a little. She felt a tentative, fragile peace begin to settle in her soul, a peace as quiet and vast as the Montana night. The peace was a fragile thing, easily shattered. It was fractured by the sound of a luxury rental car crunching its way up the gravel drive, the low, aggressive hum of its engine, an alien sound in the sanctuary's quiet. And then the sharp, insistent ring of a cell phone, a sound Donna hadn't heard in weeks, a sound that made the muscles in her shoulders instantly tense. Julian stood on the porch of her cabin, looking handsome, charismatic, and utterly, profoundly out of place. His Italian loafers were polished to a high sheen, and the dust of the sanctuary seemed to actively refuse to stick to them. His cologne, a cold, sterile scent she had once associated with success, now smelled only of confinement. He said he had come to get her back. He said he missed her. But his language was the language of their old life, a dialect of mergers and acquisitions, of salvaging their professional reputation, of second-round funding and market shares. He spoke of her time at the sanctuary as a charming, rustic sabbatical, a quaint little detour before her inevitable return to the real world. He framed her failures as problems he, and only he, could solve. "Come back, Donna," he urged, his hand resting on her arm with an easy, familiar possessiveness. "We can fix this. Don't throw away your entire life for a bunch of stray animals and a man who probably doesn't even own a decent suit." Tristan saw them together from across the yard. He saw Julian's hand on her arm, saw the familiar, tense set of her shoulders, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. He gave a single brief nod in their direction and then turned away, his retreat so complete, so absolute, that it was as if a door had been quietly but firmly closed between them. He was once again the polite, distant caretaker, his eyes holding nothing but the vast, impersonal patience of the landscape. Donna felt herself torn in two. Julian spoke her old language, a language of ambition and validation, a language she had once craved more than anything. Why did it sound so foreign now? Why did it feel like a cage? Tristan represented a peace she was only just beginning to believe she deserved, a quiet, steady strength that felt more real, more valuable than any stock option or public offering. The conflict was a storm inside her, and Ash, with his preternatural sensitivity, felt every turbulent gust. He became agitated, difficult, shying away from her touch, his eyes rolling with a familiar wild fear. He was a mirror, reflecting the turmoil of her own fractured soul. Julian stayed for 2 days, his presence a constant low-grade irritant. His phone buzzed incessantly, a nervous, anxious sound that grated on the sanctuary's deep, abiding silence. He talked of their future, a future that sounded exactly like their past, a future that felt like a beautifully appointed, elegantly furnished prison. On the second evening, as Julian was once again outlining a strategy for their professional comeback, Donna found herself looking past him, out the window of her cabin, towards the distant, darkening mountains. She felt a profound, aching longing for the quiet companionship of the man who smelled of sagebrush and wood smoke, for the simple, uncomplicated trust of the wounded horse who was just beginning to heal. She was standing on a precipice, the life she had built on one side, a new, unknown, and terrifyingly beautiful world on the other, and she knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that she could not go back. The storm broke that night, a sudden, violent squall that descended upon the plains with the force of a physical blow. The sky turned a bruised, angry purple-grey, shot through with jagged veins of lightning. The wind howled, a primal, cathartic scream that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the world. The storm terrified Ash. He was a creature of the wild, a creature of fire and instinct, and the violent, elemental fury of the thunderstorm sent him into a blind panic. With a sound that was half scream, half whinny, he crashed through the fence of his corral and bolted, a dark, frantic shape disappearing into the rain-lashed darkness, heading for the treacherous rocky hillsides. "Let him go," Julian shouted, grabbing Donna's arm as she made a move to run after the horse. "Be reasonable, Donna, it's just an animal." His words, so calm, so logical, so utterly dismissive of the wild, beautiful, broken thing that had become the centre of her world, were the final, irrevocable straw. She shook off his hand, her eyes blazing with a cold, clear fury that made him take a step back. She found Tristan by the stables, already saddling his own horse, his movements economical and sure in the flickering light of a lantern. He didn't seem surprised to see her. He simply nodded towards a second horse, already saddled and waiting. Without a word, a silent, unbreakable understanding passing between them in the heart of the storm, she swung herself into the saddle. They rode out together into the tempest, a silent, determined team, the driving rain plastering their hair to their faces, the wind tearing at their clothes. They found Ash in a narrow ravine, his leg caught in a tangle of fallen branches, his eyes wide with terror. The sound of their approach sent him into a fresh panic, but Tristan's voice, low and steady, a calm, reassuring rumble beneath the roar of the storm, seemed to reach the terrified animal. Working together in the driving rain, their movements synchronized by a shared, unspoken purpose, they managed to calm the horse, to gentle him, to free him from the tangle of branches. The journey back to the barn was a slow, arduous one. Ash was limping, and they had to lead the horses, their boots sinking into the mud, the wind and rain a constant punishing assault. When they finally reached the shelter of the main barn, they were soaked, shivering and emotionally raw. The storm still raged outside, the rain drumming a frantic, relentless rhythm on the roof, but inside, in the warm, hay-scented darkness, there was a strange, profound silence. They stood facing each other, the lantern light casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. And in that moment, with the storm raging around them and the shared, profound relief of the rescue settling in their souls, the world seemed to narrow to the space between them. He reached out and brushed a stray wet strand of hair from her face, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle against her skin. The touch lingered, sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. The kiss that followed was slow and searching at first, a question asked in the dark, but the recognition in that touch, of shared wildness, of a resilience forged in fire, ignited something primal. The kiss deepened, becoming a raw, hungry claiming. It was the taste of rain and earth, and a longing so profound it stole the breath from her lungs. His hands were rough and sure, tangling in her wet hair, pulling her flush against him. She could feel the hard strength of his body, the frantic beat of his heart against her own. Her gasp became a moan as his mouth left hers to trace a fiery path down her throat. Their fumbling with the wet, heavy clothes was an act of desperate urgency. Buttons gave way, denim was pushed aside, and then there was only the shocking electric heat of skin meeting skin in the cool, hay-scented air. He laid her back in a pile of soft hay, the rough strands scratching faintly at her back as his hands and mouth began a slow, deliberate exploration. He worshipped her body with a reverence that made her tremble, his calloused fingertips tracing the curve of her hip, his tongue tasting the salt on her skin. He discovered every secret place, every sensitive hollow, until she was arching against him, a wordless plea on her lips. He brought their bodies together, and it was a homecoming, a collision of two worlds that had been orbiting each other from the moment they met. The rhythm of the storm outside became their own, a tempest of shared need and shattering relief. It was a silent language of touch and breath, a surrender so complete and absolute that it felt like being broken open and remade, not by force but by a profound and overwhelming tenderness. The storm outside raged on, a wild, untamed symphony of wind and rain, but in the heart of the barn, in the warm, hay-scented darkness, they created their own storm, a wild, beautiful and terrifyingly real moment that burned away the last vestiges of the woman she had been, leaving in its place something new, something stronger, something that had been forged in the heart of the fire. Several weeks later, the world was washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of impossible, aching clarity and air that tasted of clean earth and new beginnings. Julian was a ghost, a memory. A final, sterile email from him, confirming the legal dissolution of their company, had arrived a week ago. Donna had deleted it without a single pang of regret, the words dissolving into the digital ether, as ephemeral and meaningless as the life they represented. She walked out to the pasture, the late autumn sun warm on her face. Ash, though still favouring his leg, trotted to meet her, his gait no longer frantic but steady, sure. He nudged her shoulder with his head, a gesture of quiet trust and affection that filled her with a deep, uncomplicated joy. Tristan was waiting for her by the fence line, leaning against it in the sun, his silhouette a familiar, comforting shape against the vast expanse of the plains. He didn't speak, but his eyes, the colour of a clear autumn sky, asked the question that hung in the still, clean air between them. "I'm not going back," she said, her voice steady, her gaze meeting his without a flicker of doubt. "I've cashed out my remaining assets. I want to invest them in the sanctuary. This is my new venture. This is my home." A slow smile spread across his face, a smile that reached his eyes and crinkled the weathered skin at their corners. He pushed himself off the fence and pulled her into his arms, his embrace strong and sure. The kiss was no longer just comforting. It was full of promise and a deep, smiling passion. He kissed her like he was memorizing the taste of her, a taste of sun and wind and second chances. His touch was both strong and tender, a silent language that speaks of building a future, of planting roots in this wild, beautiful place. It was a promise whispered against her skin, under the vast, accepting sky. As she stood there, wrapped in his arms, her head resting against his chest, she saw them for the first time, a cluster of wild roses, late blooming and impossibly resilient, growing along the fence line, their delicate, defiant beauty a splash of colour against the weathered wood. She had come here thinking she needed to rebuild a life from the ashes, only to discover that the most beautiful things don't have to be built at all. They simply need the space to grow. Strangers in the candlelight. The rain fell on Paris with a quiet insistence, a silver veil that blurred the edges of the city and turned the cobblestones to slick, dark mirrors. It was a late autumn afternoon, the kind that held the day in a gentle, grey embrace, refusing to let go. For Thomas, the rain was a fitting accompaniment to the storm that had been raging inside him for months. a relentless tempest of memories that the end of a war had failed to quell. He walked without purpose, his American uniform feeling heavy and foreign on his shoulders, the cheerful shouts from the cafes and brasseries a language he no longer understood. He was a ghost in a city that was trying so desperately to live again. He turned down a narrow side street away from the main thoroughfare and found himself before a small dusty bookshop. La Belle Page, the faded sign read. The windows were filled not with the bright covers of new bestsellers, but with the soft, worn spines of older volumes, their titles barely legible in the fading light. It looked less like a shop and more like a sanctuary, a quiet haven from the relentless drizzle and the even more relentless noise of his own thoughts. He pushed open the door, a small bell announcing his arrival with a delicate chime, and stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, beeswax and brewing tea, a fragrance that seemed to wrap around him like a warm blanket. The shop was a labyrinth of towering shelves, books stacked in precarious piles on every available surface, the only light coming from a pair of flickering candles on a small desk in the corner, and the soft grey light filtering through the windows. It was a place of shadows and whispers, a world away from the shattered landscapes and deafening explosions that still echoed in his mind. Behind the desk sat a woman, her head bent over a ledger, a pen moving with a slow, deliberate grace across the page. She looked up as he entered, and for a moment their eyes met across the dim, book-filled space. She was younger than he had first thought, perhaps in her late 20s, with a face that held the quiet sorrow of a Madonna in a dimly lit church. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple knot, and she wore a plain grey dress that seemed to absorb the shadows around her. There was a stillness about her, a palpable sense of grief that clung to her like a fine, invisible dust. She was, he thought, the living embodiment of the shop, a keeper of stories and sorrows. "Bonjour, monsieur," she said, her voice soft, a low melody that seemed to rise from the quiet depths of the room. "Hello," he replied, his own voice sounding rough and out of place. "I was just looking for shelter from the rain." "Of course," she said, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "Please, take your time." He nodded, grateful for the dismissal, and began to wander through the narrow aisles, his fingers trailing over the worn leather spines. He was not looking for anything in particular, simply seeking a distraction, a momentary reprieve from the images that haunted his waking hours and stalked his dreams. He pulled a slim volume from a shelf, its pages brittle with age. It was a book of poetry, the words a gentle balm to his raw, frayed nerves. He stood there, lost in the rhythm of the verses, the outside world fading away until there was only the soft rustle of the pages and the steady drumming of the rain against the window pane. "La chair est triste et là, et j'ai lu tous les livres." The voice was so close he started. He turned to find her standing beside him, her eyes on the book in his hands. She had recited the line from memory, her voice a soft, resonant whisper that seemed to fill the silence between them. "Mallarmé," he said, his voice hoarse. "Yes," she replied. "A sad poem, for one so young." She looked at him then, her gaze direct and filled with an unspoken understanding, as if she could see the weariness that lay beneath the surface, the ghosts that flickered in his eyes. Poetry is a balm for the soul, is it not? It reminds us that even in the darkest of times, there is still beauty to be found. He could only nod, his throat tight with an emotion he could not name. He had spoken to no one of the darkness that had taken root inside him, yet this stranger, this quiet woman in a dusty bookshop, seemed to understand. "I was just making some tea," she said, as if sensing his inability to speak. "Would you care for a cup?" He found his voice then, a simple "yes, thank you," that felt wholly inadequate. She led him to the small desk in the corner, clearing a space for him amidst the stacks of books and papers. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her hand steady as she poured the steaming liquid into 2 delicate porcelain cups. He watched her, mesmerised by the simple grace of her movements, the way the candlelight caught the soft curve of her cheek. They sat in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the gentle clinking of their cups and the persistent murmur of the rain. The tea was hot and sweet, and he held the cup in his hands, its warmth seeping into his chilled fingers, a small tangible comfort in a world that had grown cold and unforgiving. He found himself studying her face, the fine lines around her eyes, the gentle curve of her mouth. Her name, she told him, was Elodie. She had inherited the shop from her husband, a writer, who had been killed in the war. She spoke of him with a quiet, dignified sorrow, her grief a tangible thing, a constant low hum beneath the surface of her words. He did not speak of his own losses, of the faces of the men he had seen fall, of the screams that still echoed in the dead of night. He did not need to. She seemed to know, to understand the weight of the unspoken things that lay between them. As he sat there in the warm, candlelit quiet of the bookshop, a strange sense of peace began to settle over him. It was a feeling he had not known in years, a quiet stillness that seemed to push back, however momentarily, the encroaching darkness. He'd come into the shop to escape the rain, but he realised now that it was the storm inside him that was finally beginning to quiet. The rain had slowed to a gentle patter by the time he rose to leave. The sky was a deep, bruised purple, the streetlights casting long, wavering reflections on the wet pavement. "Thank you for the tea," he said, his voice still feeling inadequate. "You're welcome any time, monsieur," she replied, her sad, beautiful eyes meeting his. He walked back out into the rain-slicked streets of Paris, the scent of old books and beeswax still clinging to him, the warmth of the teacup still lingering in his hands. He did not know when he would see her again, but he knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that he would. He had found a small, quiet corner of the world where the ghosts of his past seemed, for a moment, to have been laid to rest. He had found a fragile, unexpected sanctuary in the quiet world of a widowed French bookseller, a woman whose own sorrow seemed to mirror the unspoken grief he carried within him. And in the shared silence, in the unspoken understanding that had passed between them, a tiny, fragile spark had been kindled, a flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness. The single visit became a ritual. Every evening, as the last of the daylight bled from the Parisian sky, Thomas found himself drawn back to the quiet sanctity of Le Bel Page. He would arrive just as Elodie was preparing to close, the little bell above the door announcing his presence with a sound that was becoming increasingly familiar, a gentle counterpoint to the weary beat of his own heart. He would help her shutter the windows against the encroaching night, the simple physical task a welcome anchor in the swirling currents of his thoughts. Then, with the door locked and the world shut out, they would sit together in the warm, flickering candlelight, the towering shelves of books standing as silent witnesses to their burgeoning connection. At first, their evenings were filled with the comfortable quiet that had marked their first meeting. They would read, sometimes for hours on end, the only sounds the soft rustle of turning pages and the occasional sigh of contentment. He would watch her as she read, the candlelight casting a golden glow on her face, her expression a mixture of concentration and a deep, abiding sadness that seemed to have settled into the very lines of her being. He learned the contours of her face by heart, the gentle slope of her nose, the delicate curve of her lips, the way a stray strand of dark hair would escape from its simple knot and curl against the soft skin of her neck. Slowly, tentatively, the silence between them began to fill with words. She would read a passage aloud, her voice a low melodic murmur that seemed to bring the poetry to life, and he would listen, captivated, the verses weaving a fragile tapestry of shared emotion around them. He found himself speaking of things he had never spoken of before, not to the army doctors with their clinical questions and detached sympathy, not even to his own family in the carefully censored letters he sent home. He spoke of the endless, bone-wearing boredom of the trenches, of the sudden, terrifying bursts of violence that shattered the monotony, of the quiet, gnawing fear that was a constant companion. The words tumbled out of him, hesitant at first, then with a growing urgency, as if a dam had broken, releasing a flood of pent-up grief and confusion. She listened without judgment, her quiet presence a steady, unwavering anchor in the storm of his confession. And in return she began to speak of her own loss, of her husband, Antoine, a man whose love for words had been as deep and profound as her own. She spoke of their shared dreams, of the life they had planned to build together within the book-lined walls of the shop, a life that had been stolen from them by the same war that had left Thomas so irrevocably broken. She showed him a small faded photograph of a smiling young man with kind eyes and a shock of unruly dark hair, his image a ghostly presence in the small intimate world they were creating. "I told myself I would never love again," she confessed one evening, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears in the candlelight. It felt like a betrayal. He reached across the small space that separated them and took her hand, his fingers gently closing around hers. It was the first time they had touched, and a jolt of electricity, sharp and unexpected, shot through him. Her skin was soft and cool, and he could feel the delicate flutter of her pulse beneath his thumb. He did not know what to say, what comfort he could possibly offer to a grief that so closely mirrored his own. So he simply held her hand, his touch a silent acknowledgement of their shared sorrow. He found himself looking at her in a new way, his gaze lingering on the gentle curve of her neck, the soft swell of her breasts beneath the simple grey dress. He noticed the scent of her perfume, a faint, elusive fragrance of lavender and old paper that seemed to cling to her, to the very air around her. He began to crave her presence with an intensity that surprised him, the quiet hours spent in her company becoming the only moments of real peace in his otherwise turbulent existence. The physical distance between them began to shrink, the small book-strewn space of the shop becoming a world of its own, charged with an unspoken magnetic energy. A lingering touch as they reached for the same volume, a shared glance that lasted a moment too long, the soft brush of her arm against his as she poured their tea. The air between them crackled with a quiet, insistent hum, a silent symphony of unspoken desire. One evening, as the rain beat a steady rhythm against the windows, he found himself standing before a shelf of English poetry, a book of Keats in his hands. He turned to find her standing close behind him, her presence a warm, solid reality in the dimly lit aisle. "I feel more at peace here with you than I have in years," he said, his voice low and thick with an emotion he could not quite name. "It's like you're the quiet I've been searching for." She looked up at him, her eyes dark pools of sorrow and something else, something that made his heart beat a little faster. She did not speak, but he could see the answer in her gaze, the silent acknowledgement of the truth that lay between them. He could feel the pull of her, the irresistible gravity of her quiet strength, her gentle, wounded spirit. He wanted to close the small space that separated them, to take her in his arms and hold her, to offer what little comfort he could. But he was afraid of the depth of his own feelings, of the fragile, tentative hope that was beginning to take root in the barren landscape of his heart. He had come to Paris a ghost, a hollowed-out shell of the man he had once been. But in the quiet, dusty corners of a small bookshop, in the gentle, unassuming presence of a woman who understood the language of sorrow, he was beginning slowly, tentatively to feel alive again. He was beginning to feel that perhaps, just perhaps, it was not a betrayal to love again, but a coming home. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, a crisp white envelope that felt unnervingly foreign, in the familiar book-scented air of the shop. It was from his commanding officer, the words stark and unforgiving against the page. His orders. He was to return to America. The war was over. His duty done. He was to be discharged, sent home to a life he no longer recognized, a world that felt as distant and unreal as a half-forgotten dream. He read the letter twice, the words blurring before his eyes, a cold, hard knot forming in the pit of his stomach. He had known this day would come, had known that his time in Paris, his time with Elodie, was a temporary reprieve, a fragile, borrowed peace. But the reality of it, the stark finality of the words on the page, was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs and leaving him feeling hollow and exposed. He looked across the shop at Elodie, who was arranging a display of leather-bound volumes in the window, her movements filled with their usual quiet grace. The late afternoon sun breaking through the clouds for the first time in days streamed through the glass, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and casting a golden halo around her dark hair. She was so beautiful, so achingly familiar, a part of him, of the quiet, ordered world he had come to crave. How could he leave her? How could he return to the loud, empty spaces of his former life, a life that no longer held any meaning for him? The news fell between them like a stone, sinking into the quiet depths of their shared world and sending ripples of unspoken anxiety out to the very edges. He watched as the light seemed to drain from her face, her eyes growing distant, her smile, always so fragile, disappearing altogether. She did not cry, did not rage against the injustice of it. She simply withdrew, retreating into the silent, sorrowful fortress of her grief, a place he could not follow. The easy intimacy they had shared, the comfortable silence that had been their language, was replaced by a strained, palpable tension. The air in the small shop, once so warm and inviting, grew thick with unspoken fears, with the words they could not bring themselves to say. He wanted to tell her that he would not go, that he would find a way to stay, to build a life with her in this city of ghosts and memories. But the words caught in his throat, choked by the weight of his own uncertainty, by the sudden, terrifying realization that he had nothing to offer her but his own brokenness. He tried to draw her out, to breach the walls she had erected around herself, but his efforts were met with a quiet, unyielding resistance. She would answer his questions with polite, monosyllabic replies, her eyes focused on some distant point beyond his shoulder. The evenings that had been their sanctuary became a form of exquisite torture, the silence between them no longer a comfort, but a vast, empty chasm. He began to see her only in glimpses, her face a pale, fleeting image in the crowded streets of Paris. He would catch sight of her walking along the Seine, her figure small and solitary against the grand, indifferent backdrop of the city, and a wave of such profound and helpless longing would wash over him that it left him breathless. He would call her name, but the wind would snatch the sound from his lips, and she would walk on, oblivious, disappearing into the anonymous crowds. He grew desperate, the days slipping by with an agonizing slowness, each one bringing him closer to the date of his departure. He began to haunt the places he knew she frequented, the small cafes where she would sometimes take her morning coffee, the quiet parks where she would walk in the afternoons. He would sit for hours nursing a single drink, his eyes scanning the faces of the passers-by, searching for the one face that had come to mean more to him than any other. He found her one afternoon in the Jardin du Luxembourg, sitting on a bench beneath the skeletal branches of a chestnut tree, a book lying open and unread in her lap. She was staring at the grey churning waters of the fountain, her expression one of such profound and desolate sorrow that it stopped his heart. He sat down beside her, his own grief a pale reflection of the anguish he saw in her eyes. "I thought what we had was real," he said, his voice rough with a pain he could no longer conceal. "But you're pushing me away. Is this all just a game to you?" She turned to him then, her eyes dark with a torment he could not begin to comprehend. "A game," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "You think this is a game?" "What else am I to think?" he cried, his own carefully constructed composure beginning to crumble. "You won't talk to me. You won't look at me. It's as if I'm already gone." "Perhaps it would be better if you were," she said, her voice so low he could barely hear her over the mournful sigh of the wind. "Be better for you to leave, to forget you ever knew me." Her words were a slap in the face, a cold, cruel dismissal that left him reeling. He stared at her, his mind struggling to make sense of the sudden, inexplicable shift in her, the cold, hard wall that had risen between them. He did not know that her withdrawal was born of a terrible fear, the fear of loving a man again only to lose him. He did not know that looking at him, a soldier in a foreign land, she saw the ghost of her husband and the spectre of another unbearable loss. In pushing Thomas away, she was trying to protect her own shattered heart from breaking all over again. All he knew was the pain of her rejection, the sharp, bitter sting of her words. He rose to his feet, his own heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. "If that's what you want," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He turned and walked away, not looking back, the taste of bitter coffee and unspoken fears a poison on his tongue. The cold, impersonal streets of Paris seemed to mock him, the stark white of the letter in his pocket a constant, taunting reminder of the life he was being forced to return to, a life that now felt like a prison. The bookshop, once his sanctuary, was now a place of silence and sorrow, the quiet that had once soothed him now a deafening roar. He was adrift again, lost in a sea of grief and confusion, the fragile spark of hope that had been kindled in the darkness now extinguished, leaving him more alone than he had ever been before. The day of his departure arrived, a grey, sullen morning that mirrored the bleak landscape of his heart. He had not seen her, not spoken to her, since their painful, truncated conversation in the park. He had gone to the bookshop once the day before, but the door had been locked, a small handwritten sign in the window announcing that it was closed. He had stood there for a long time, staring at the darkened windows, a sense of finality settling over him like a shroud. He could not leave like this. He could not leave with the bitter taste of her rejection in his mouth, with the unanswered questions hanging between them like a thick, suffocating fog. He had to see her one last time, to understand, to hear the truth from her own lips, no matter how painful it might be. He found her in a small, secluded park at the edge of the city, a place of tangled, overgrown gardens and crumbling stone benches. She was standing beneath a gnarled, ancient oak, its bare branches reaching like skeletal fingers towards the bruised, purple sky. The first drops of a cold, persistent rain had begun to fall, and she had not even seemed to notice, her face upturned to the heavens, her expression one of utter, desolate despair. He walked towards her, his footsteps silent on the damp, leaf-strewn ground. She did not turn as he approached, did not seem to be aware of his presence until he was standing directly in front of her. "I couldn't leave without seeing you," he said, his voice low and steady, belying the tremor in his hands. "I don't care about your past, Elodie. I only care about you." His words seemed to break through the shell of her sorrow, her carefully constructed defences crumbling before the simple, unadorned truth of his declaration. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek, followed by another and another, until she was sobbing great, wrenching sobs that seemed to be torn from the very depths of her soul. "You don't understand," she cried, her voice a raw, broken whisper. "You can't stay, you can't love me." "Why not?" he asked, his heart aching with a love so fierce, so protective that it threatened to consume him. "Tell me why." And so she told him the truth about Antoine. He had been part of the resistance, a quiet hero who used the bookshop as a drop point for messages. He was a poet, not a soldier, but he had fought for France in the only way he knew how. One evening he was caught. Someone had talked. The Gestapo came for him in the night, dragging him from their bed. She never saw him again. They sent her his wedding ring a month later, nothing more. "He was everything to me," she whispered, her voice choked with a grief that was still as raw as an open wound. "And they took him, just like that. How can I love you, a soldier so far from home? Knowing that you could be taken from me too? I cannot survive that again. It is better to be alone." She fell silent then, her confession hanging in the cold, damp air between them. He looked at her, at the beautiful, tormented face, at the eyes that were drowning in a sea of grief and fear, and he felt a wave of such profound and overwhelming love for her that it left him breathless. He did not see a woman pushing him away. He saw a woman terrified of being left behind. He was shaken, yes, but his love for her was a fierce, unwavering flame in the darkness, a love that was stronger than her fear, stronger than the ghosts of their shared past. He knew in that moment, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could not leave her. He would not. He pulled her into his arms, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was not gentle, but filled with a raw, aching need, a desperate attempt to erase the pain from her face, to silence the demons that whispered in her ear. His hands tangled in her rain-soaked hair, her fingers clutching at the rough fabric of his uniform. It was a kiss of reassurance, of shared sorrow, a silent, fervent promise that he would not leave her, that he would not let her face the darkness alone. He kissed her like he was breathing her in, each brush of his mouth deepening the ache in her chest. His hands traced the curve of her back, drawing shivers that left her breathless. When their bodies pressed together, it was fire and fragility all at once, a dance of need and tenderness, where every sigh seemed to carry a lifetime of longing. He could feel the rough bark of the tree against her back, the cool, damp press of her clothes against his skin. The scent of rain and wet earth filled his senses, mingling with the salt of her tears on his lips. He was drowning in her, in the raw, unvarnished truth of her, and he knew, with a clarity that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that he had found his home. He had come to Paris a soldier, a man haunted by the ghosts of war. But in the arms of this broken, beautiful woman, he had found a reason to stay, a reason to fight for a future he had not believed was possible. He had chosen love over duty, had chosen to remain in this city of shadows and secrets, to build a new life from the ashes of the old. He had chosen her, and in that choice he had finally, truly come home. The decision once made settled in his soul with the quiet, irrefutable weight of truth. He would not be returning to America. He would not be returning to the life that no longer felt like his own. He had found his home here, in the rain-slicked streets of Paris, in the quiet, dusty corners of a small bookshop, in the arms of a woman who had shown him the true meaning of courage. The days that followed were filled with a quiet, tentative hope, a sense of new beginnings. The bookshop, once a symbol of Elodie's past, of the life she had lost, became a symbol of their shared future, a sanctuary where they could begin to rebuild, not just their own lives, but the world around them. The morning sun, streaming through the newly washed windows, seemed to carry with it the promise of a brighter day, the scent of fresh-baked bread from the bakery next door, a reminder of the simple, enduring pleasures of life. They talked of the future, of a life together, their plans a fragile, beautiful tapestry woven from threads of hope and love. They would keep the shop, of course, its book-lined walls a testament to the enduring power of stories, of words, to heal and to connect. They would fill its shelves with new voices, with tales of survival and resilience, of love and loss and the indomitable strength of the human spirit. The ghosts of the past had not disappeared, but their power had begun to wane, their mournful whispers fading into the background, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of their shared life. He still woke sometimes in the dead of night, the echoes of the battlefield ringing in his ears, but now, when he reached out in the darkness, he found her there, her warm, solid presence a steady anchor in the storm. Later that night, in the small, simple apartment above the bookshop, they came together again. This time there was no desperation, no raw, aching need, only a deep, abiding love that flowed between them like a quiet, steady river. He undressed her slowly, his touch a gentle, reverent exploration of the body he was coming to know, as well as his own. He kissed the scars on her soul, the places where she had been wounded, where the world had left its mark, and in his touch she found a healing she had not thought possible. Their love-making was a quiet celebration, a testament to their survival, a silent, fervent promise of the life they would build together. There were no words, only the language of touch, of skin against skin, of the shared, shuddering breaths that were a testament to the profound, ineffable connection that bound them, one to the other. Afterwards they lay tangled in the soft, worn sheets, the moonlight painting silver stripes across the floor. The silence between them was no longer a chasm, but a comfortable, shared space, filled with the unspoken truths of their hearts. He had been a soldier, a man defined by war, by the things he had seen, the things he had done. She had been a widow, a woman defined by loss, by the ghost of a love that had been stolen from her. But together in the quiet corners of a war-torn world, they had found a new definition, a new beginning. They had found their peace, not in the grand gestures of heroes, not in the empty promises of a world that was struggling to heal itself, but in the simple, profound courage of a love that chose to stay. And as he lay there, with her head resting on his chest, her soft, even breaths, a gentle rhythm against his skin, he knew that he was no longer a ghost. He was home. Whispers of the bare moon. The world of Isabel Rowe was one of muted colours and muffled sounds, a place of suffocating politeness. Her father, Judge Rowe, presided over their manicured estate with the same cold, unassailable logic he applied to his courtroom. It was a world of clipped hedges, of cold marble that seemed to leach the warmth from one's skin, and of whispered judgments that hung in the air like dust motes in the autumn light. Today, at an outdoor luncheon that felt more like a tribunal than a celebration, Isabel was the prize exhibit. Dressed in a gown the colour of a pale sky, she was a perfect porcelain doll, placed just so, her discomfort a fine, invisible crack in her composure. Her father was holding forth, his voice a smooth, confident baritone discussing his recent legal victory over the local tribe's land claims. He spoke of progress, of economic necessity, of the unimpeachable power of the law he represented. He dismissed the tribe's centuries of history with the wave of a hand, as one might dismiss a fly. "Sentimental nonsense," he declared to the nodding heads round the table. "You cannot halt the march of progress for the sake of a few old superstitions." Isabel felt a familiar nausea rise in her throat. She picked at the lace on her sleeve, the threads catching on her manicured nails. His world was a cage, and its bars were forged from his certainty. Later, seeking a moment's respite, she slipped away from the drone of conversation and walked toward the edge of the property, where the judge's immaculate lawn gave way to the unruly chaos of the forest. The air here was different, carrying on it a scent she couldn't name, something wild and mournful. A few steps further, and the scent became acrid, the sharp tang of smoke and grief. She saw it then, the edge of the burnt lands, a scar of black and grey against the vibrant golds and reds of the late autumn woods. It was the land her father's victory had condemned. She was so absorbed in the desolate beauty of the scene that she didn't hear him approach. One moment she was alone, the next a hand was over her mouth, and a hard, warm body was pressed against her back. A scream died in her throat, smothered by a calloused palm that smelled of earth and ash. She struggled, her heels digging uselessly into the soft turf, but it was like fighting against a mountain. The arm around her waist was unyielding, yet it held her with a surprising firm gentleness. There was no brutality in the touch, only an inexorable strength. He moved with a silence that was terrifying, his feet making no sound on the forest floor. He was a shadow, a phantom of the woods she had been taught to fear. He carried her deeper into the smouldering forest, away from the manicured lawns and the sound of her father's voice. The devastation was immense, a cathedral of ancient trees reduced to blackened skeletons. The ground was a carpet of grey ash that puffed up around his moccasined feet. The sharp, clean scent of her lavender perfume felt like a violation here, a shrill note in a symphony of sorrow. He finally set her down in a small unburnt clearing, though he did not release her arm. He was tall, with hair as black as a raven's wing, and eyes that held the deep, quiet wisdom of the forest itself. His face was stark, carved from granite and sorrow, and his clothes were simple deerskin, stained with soot. He did not look at her like a prisoner, but like a burden he had been forced to carry. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He looked at her, his gaze missing nothing. "I am a Hyoka." His voice was low and resonant, like the thrum of a distant drum. He finally released her arm, and she instinctively clutched the cold, smooth silver of the locket at her neck, its weight a familiar anchor in this terrifying new world. Inside was a miniature of her father's face, smiling and sure. "My father's council," a Hyoka began, his voice devoid of emotion, "decreed that the judge's daughter should be taken, that your life should be given in payment for this." He gestured to the charred remains of the forest around them. "They sent me to kill you." Isabel's blood ran cold. She could feel the frantic thud of her own heart against her ribs. But he had not killed her. He had brought her here, to the heart of his people's pain. "I disobeyed," he said simply. He looked away from her, toward the ruin of a great oak, its branches like skeletal arms raised in supplication. "My father is Howling Wolf. He believes in a law of blood for blood. I follow a different law, one that whispers from the earth itself. It told me to find you." "Then let me go," she pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. "Please." A Hyoka turned his gaze back to her, and for the first time she saw something other than sorrow in his eyes. It was a profound, weary conflict. "You cannot go back. To my people you are a ghost, an emblem of their pain. Your father's world sees you as a victim to be avenged, and my father's world sees you as a debt to be paid. There is no place for you now." "What do you mean?" she cried, panic rising like a tide within her. He stepped closer, and his presence was overwhelming, elemental. "I have disobeyed my father. I have brought you here, into the heart of the wound. The council will not harbour you. They will see your white skin and hear your father's words in every breath you take." He paused, his dark eyes searching her face as if seeking something he wasn't sure he would find. "There is only one path I can see, one way to grant you sanctuary." She waited, her breath held tight in her chest. "You must agree to be presented as my spirit-bonded bride," he said, the words falling like stones into the silence. "A woman brought to me by a vision. The lie must be so strong it becomes a truth. Only a sacred designation, a bond blessed by the spirits, will protect you from my father's law." Isabel stared at him, aghast. It was madness, a lie upon a lie. And yet, looking into his steady, solemn gaze, she saw no other choice. She was trapped between two worlds, and this strange, silent man was offering her the only bridge. She thought of his hands stained with soot and earth, yet holding her with a strange reverence as if she were not a captive. but a prophecy he was reluctant to fulfill. She gave a single shaky nod. The first whisper of the bare moon had been spoken, and her old world had already turned to ash. A yoker's dwelling was not a cage, but a sanctuary. Built into the side of a hill overlooking a misty valley, the cabin was simple and sturdy, crafted from the forest itself. It was a world away from the cold marble and suffocating damask of her father's house. Here the air was warm and smelled of cedar, of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, of beeswax from the candles that cast a soft golden glow on the rough-hewn walls. The tone of their days was one of quiet observation, of a slowly thawing fear. The lie began the moment they arrived. He presented her to the few hunters and trappers they encountered on the paths near his home. He spoke in his native tongue, a language of soft consonants and flowing vowels, and though she could not understand the words, she understood their weight. He spoke of her with a solemn gravity that made the falsehood feel true. She felt the eyes of his people on her, saw their suspicion in the tightness of their mouths, but she also saw their deference to him, to the shamanic blood that ran in his veins. She was the spirit bride, a creature of vision, and so she was treated with a cautious, fearful respect. He began to teach her, not with lectures and books, but with his hands and his solace. He taught her the new language of this world, a language spoken by the wind in the pines and the cry of the hawk. He showed her how to find north by the moss on the trees, how to listen to the chatter of the birds for warnings of an approaching storm or a predator. When she sliced her hand open while clumsily trying to chop vegetables, he said nothing of her foolishness. Instead, he led her into the woods, his long fingers gently guiding her to a patch of feathery green leaves. Yarrow. He crushed them into a poultice, his touch on her skin, impersonal yet deeply, shockingly intimate, and bound the wound with a strip of clean linen. The sting of the cut was nothing compared to the jolt that shot through her at the brief, practiced touch of his fingers against hers. They lived in a shared solitude, two ghosts haunting the edge of a broken world. The nights were the hardest. The silence of the valley was immense, broken only by the hoot of an owl or the distant howl of a wolf. In those long hours, Isabel would lie awake, wrapped in a rough wool blanket that smelled of him, of wood smoke and pine, and listen to the steady rhythm of his breathing from across the small room. She would think of her father, of the life that had been stolen from her, and a wave of grief and rage would wash over her. But then she would think of Ahioka, of the quiet dignity with which he moved, the gentle patience of his teachings, and a different, more confusing emotion would take its place. One night, as they sat by the fire, the flames dancing in his dark eyes, she found the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her. "Why are you in exile?" He was silent for a long time, feeding sticks into the fire. The only sound was the crackle and hiss of the burning wood. "When I was a boy," he said at last, his voice a low murmur, "I had a vision. I saw the Great Bear Spirit, the mother of our people, weeping as the forest burned. I told my father, and he saw it as a sign of weakness. He said a warrior's spirit should be filled with rage at the fire, not sorrow. He said my heart was too soft, that I felt the pain of the earth too deeply to be a leader of men." He poked at the embers with a stick, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "He has not looked at me the same since. I was marked as different. It is better that I live on the periphery." In his words, Isabel heard an echo of her own life. She too had been marked as different, her own quiet, introspective nature a disappointment to her powerful, pragmatic father. "I had been taught to fear the wild, to see it as a thing to be conquered," she found herself saying, the words tumbling out of her before she could stop them. "But living with you, I began to understand it was not wildness I had feared, but freedom." He looked up at her then, and the space between them crackled with a sudden intense connection. He saw her, truly saw her, not as the judge's daughter, not as a spirit bride, but as another soul living on the periphery. Her perception of him shifted, subtly at first, then all at once. She began to see past her fear, past the strangeness of her situation. She watched the way he moved, with an economy of motion that was both powerful and graceful, like a panther. She listened to the cadence of his voice when he spoke the names of the plants and the stars, a soft poetry that made her own language feel harsh and clumsy. She ate the rabbit stew he cooked over the fire, smoky and rich, and felt a nourishment that went deeper than her bones. One evening he pointed to the full silver orb rising over the valley. The bare moon, he said. It was under the light of that same moon that he had taken her, and under its light that she was being reborn. The ruse of being his bride began to feel less like a performance and more like a strange, unsettling truth taking root in her soul. She would catch him looking at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes before he would turn away. The rough texture of the wool blanket he had given her, the intricate patterns of the beadwork on his moccasins, the steady, quiet presence of him in the small cabin, these were the anchors of her new reality. In her old home, she had 1,000 books that spoke of truth, but none of them had taught her the name of a single flower, or the feel of the earth breathing beneath her feet. The summons came on a morning when the air was sharp with the promise of winter. A young boy from the village, his face a mask of solemn duty, arrived with a message for Ahioka. He was to present himself before his father, Howling Wolf, and the Council of Elders. Ahioka's jaw tightened as he listened to the boy's message, his eyes dark with a familiar weary pain. He was reluctant to leave Isabel, his gaze lingering on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice low. "Do not leave the cabin. You will be safe here." But as she watched him disappear down the winding path, his broad back straight and proud, a new and unfamiliar emotion took root in her heart. It was not fear for herself, but for him. She had been a passive creature her entire life, a doll to be arranged and admired. But something had shifted within her in this small, quiet cabin. She was no longer just the judge's daughter. She was Ahioka's spirit bride, and the lie had become her shield, her identity. And now, the man who'd given her that shield was walking into the heart of the danger that she had brought upon him. Driven by a mixture of dread and a fierce, nascent protectiveness, she disobeyed him. She wrapped herself in a dark cloak and followed him at a distance, her city-bred clumsiness making her feel like a charging bull in his silent world. She moved from tree to tree, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs until she reached the edge of the tribal village. It was a collection of modest wooden structures, nestled in a deep, protected cove of the forest. The air here was different from the peaceful solitude of Ahioka's valley. It was tense, heavy with unspoken grief and suspicion. The smoke from a central council fire hung thick and acrid in the air, casting long, wavering shadows that felt accusatory. It was a scene of Bronte-esque Gothic tension, a place of secrets and simmering resentments. Isabel hid in the shadows at the edge of the council circle, her face pale, her breath held tight in her chest. She saw Ahioka standing before a group of older men, his face impassive. At their centre sat an older man with a face like a weathered stone, his eyes burning with a cold, unyielding fire. This, she knew, was Howling Wolf. He spoke in his native tongue, his voice a harsh, guttural torrent of rage. The words were alien to her, but their meaning was brutally clear. He did not believe in the spirit bride. He saw her as a white devil, a poison brought into their midst. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at his son. "You bring this ghost into our sacred places and call it destiny. I call it treason. Her skin is the colour of the ash that covers our hunting grounds." Isabel flinched as if struck. The venom in his voice was a physical thing, a poison that seeped into her very bones. She saw the faces of the other elders, saw the doubt and suspicion warring with their respect for Ahioka's spiritual authority. Ahioka stood his ground. He did not raise his voice. He met his father's fury with a quiet, unshakable dignity. His own words a calm, steady river against the storm of his father's rage. He spoke of his vision, of the whispers of the earth, of a law that was older and deeper than the law of vengeance. But the seed of doubt had been planted. The wound was too raw, the grief too fresh. How could they trust a vision that brought the daughter of their enemy into their heart? The council ended with no resolution, the tension hanging in the air like an unsheathed blade. Ahioka turned and walked away, his jaw tight with a pain that was more than just the sting of his father's words. It was the pain of a man torn between his people and his soul. He found her on the path back to the cabin. She had not meant for him to see her, but she had been unable to move, frozen by the terrible scene she had just witnessed. He stopped, his dark eyes meeting hers, and the fragile peace that had grown between them in the quiet solitude of the cabin was shattered. The weight of the real world, of his father's hatred and her father's sins, came crashing down upon them. "You followed me," he said, his voice flat. "I was afraid for you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Your fear does not help." The words were harsh, clipped. "Your presence here, it is a fire that will consume us both." In that moment, hearing the venom in his father's voice, she was no longer a judge's daughter. She was the weapon being used against the only man who had shown her mercy. My safety was his ruin. The cold dread that had been coiling in her stomach now felt like a block of ice. The lie that had been their shield was now the very thing that would destroy them. He did not speak another word. He simply grabbed her hand, his grip hard and urgent, and pulled her off the path. He moved with a desperate primal urgency, not back toward the fragile safety of the cabin, but deeper into the wild, into the heart of the ancient forest. The world became a blur of green and brown, the slap of branches against her face, the burn of her lungs as she struggled to keep up with his long, silent strides. They finally stopped before a thundering curtain of water, a powerful waterfall that crashed into a deep crystalline pool below. The roar was deafening, a raw elemental sound that drowned out the world. The last light of the day was fading, but the full silver disk of the bare moon was rising, its light casting an ethereal glow on the mist that rose from the falls. Without a word, he pulled her forward, through the cold, shocking curtain of water, and into the secret space that lay behind it. They were in a grotto, a hidden, sacred place. The air was cool and damp, smelling of wet stone and ancient earth. Shafts of moonlight pierced the darkness, illuminating the small cavern in a painterly chiaroscuro of silver and shadow. They stood there, shivering and soaked, the roar of the waterfall creating a world out of time, a sanctuary from the hatred and fear that lay just beyond the veil of water. And then the tension that had been stretched taut between them finally snapped. "My vision," he began, his voice raw, ragged, barely audible above the thunder of the falls. "The weeping bear was not my only one." He turned to face her, his eyes burning with a desperate intensity in the dim light. Water dripped from his black hair, tracing the hard lines of his face. "For years I have dreamt of you. A woman with a pale face and eyes the colour of a winter sky. I heard your voice in my dreams, though I did not understand the words. I saw your fear, your loneliness." He took a step closer, his hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs gently brushing the wet skin of her cheeks. "I did not save you out of mercy alone, Isabel. I saved you because my spirit has always known you. I saved you because you were the other half of my own soul." The confession hung in the air between them, more powerful, more binding than any lie they had ever told. The walls between them, captor and captive, his world and hers, the lie they had built and the truth he had just revealed, crumbled into dust. In that moment she understood. The ruse had to become real. Not for the council, not for his father, but for them. It was the only way. He kissed her then, and it was not a gentle kiss. It was a collision, a desperate, hungry release of all the fear and longing that had coiled in the silence between them. His mouth was hard and demanding on hers, and she met his hunger without hesitation, a wildness she hadn't known she possessed surging through her veins. Her hands tangled in his wet hair, pulling him closer as a low sound, half sob, half moan, tore from her throat. The world narrowed to the thunder of the waterfall and the frantic beat of their hearts. His hands, usually so careful and restrained, were now instruments of exquisite discovery. He didn't rip her wet clothes away. The act was far more deliberate, a slow, sacred unveiling that was its own form of torment. His fingers worked the buttons of her tunic, each touch a spark against her cold, damp skin. The rough wool peeled away, exposing the pale skin of her shoulders and throat to the cool, misty air of the grotto. The contrast made her shiver, a violent tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. The moonlight filtered through the curtain of water, painted the lines of her body in strokes of silver and shadow. Her fear had burned away, leaving in its place a profound, aching need that pooled hot and heavy deep inside her. This was a different kind of surrender, not of a captive, but of a soul to its missing half. "Isabel," he whispered, his voice a raw prayer against her skin, and then his hands began their worship. He traced the delicate line of her collarbone with one calloused finger, and a jolt of pure sensation shot through her, so intense it made her gasp. She felt utterly exposed, utterly seen, as his hands learned every curve, every secret hollow of her body. They slid down her ribs, exploring the gentle flare of her hips, the soft plane of her stomach. She felt her muscles quiver and contract under his touch. No one had ever touched her like this, with such reverent hunger, as if he were memorizing her with his fingertips. A whimper escaped her lips. Her own hands, clumsy with a desperate need, worked at the ties of his clothes until they fell away. He was beautiful, a creature of earth and moonlight, his skin gleaming with the mist of the falls. He laid her back against the cold, smooth stone of the grotto wall. The shock of the cold was a stark, electrifying contrast to the fire of his skin against hers. His mouth replaced his hands, tasting the salt and river water from her skin. He kissed the hollow of her throat, the frantic pulse he found there, then moved lower, his lips tracing a hot path over her skin that made her arch her back in a silent plea. Isabel's head fell back against the stone, her eyes fluttering closed as she gave herself over to the symphony of sensation. He rose over her, and she felt the heat of his body, the promise of a deeper connection. He paused, his dark eyes boring into hers, a silent question passing between them. She answered by reaching for him, pulling him down, a silent yes that echoed in the roaring chamber. When their bodies finally joined, it was a slow, deep union that stole her breath and filled a void she never knew she had. It was a claiming, a deliberate, sacred act that sealed their fates together. For a moment, he remained still, letting her body adjust to the glorious, overwhelming closeness of him. Then he began to move. It was a primal, powerful rhythm, a dance of shadow and light in the secret heart of the world. Her own soft, breathless moans merged with the thunder of the water. The feeling of the cold stone against her back grounded her as he took her higher, their movements becoming more urgent. He was not just touching her body, he was touching her soul, and she was giving it freely, joyfully. The pleasure built within her, a searing, unbearable heat that coiled tighter and tighter until she thought she would shatter. The climax was a shared, shuddering wave, a violent, beautiful tearing away of the veil. A hoarse cry was torn from his throat, and her own release was a blinding flash of white light behind her eyes as she called his name into the roaring darkness. In the echoing silence that followed, broken only by the eternal pulse of the waterfall, they clung to each other, their bodies still trembling from the force of their connection. He collapsed against her, his forehead resting on hers, their breath mingling in the cool misty air. Two souls, once broken and lost, now forged into one in the heart of the bare moon's secret sanctuary. Dawn broke over the forest, the light soft and forgiving, the mist rising from the damp earth like the ghosts of the night's passions. Word had travelled, carried on the wind, or by unseen messengers. Her father had come. They met in a neutral clearing at the edge of the forest, a place that belonged to neither world. Judge Rowe was flanked by a small party of armed men, his face a mask of grim determination. Opposite them stood Howling Wolf and the tribal elders, their faces equally hard and unyielding. It was a standoff, a silent war of wills between two worlds that had only ever known conflict. But then a new figure stepped into the space between them. It was Isabel, with a Hioka at her side, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. She was no longer the fragile porcelain doll who had been taken from the edge of the manicured lawn. She stood tall and straight, her fine silk gown replaced by practical deerskin leggings and a simple tunic. Her hair was no longer in an elaborate coiffure, but in a single thick braid, woven with a single hawk's feather that a Hioka had given her. She looked at her father, her heart aching with a love that was now tempered by a new, unshakable strength. "Father," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing with an authority he had never heard from her before. "I was not harmed. I was saved." She became the bridge. She turned to Howling Wolf and spoke, not in his tongue, but in the language of her heart, a language of respect and understanding. She spoke of her own captivity in her father's world, of the freedom she had found in the heart of the forest. And then she began to translate, her voice the calm, steady link between the two proud, stubborn men. She translated her father's fear into a language of parental love, and she translated Howling Wolf's grief into a language of a people's pain. Finally, she turned back to her father. "I am not coming home," she said, the words both a declaration and a plea. "Because I am home." She took a Hioka's hand in hers, their fingers lacing together in a gesture of simple, profound unity. "My place is here, with him." Judge Rowe looked at his daughter, truly looked at her for the first time, not as an extension of his own ambition, but as a woman. He saw the strength in her eyes, the set of her jaw, the way she stood, no longer bowed by the weight of his expectations. He saw the fierce, protective love in a Hioka's eyes as he looked at her, and in that moment, the judge's cold, logical world cracked. He could not fight this. He could not win this, because this was not a battle to be won, but a truth to be accepted. He gave a single sharp nod, a gesture of relinquishment. He was not giving his daughter to a captor, but to a life she had freely chosen. Before he left, he ordered his men to leave a crate of supplies, blankets, salted meat, medicine, a silent, grudging gesture of peace. Isabel and her Hioka walked back to their cabin hand in hand, the world quiet and still around them. The threat had passed. The war was over. As they entered the small warm space, Isabel walked to a small wooden chest where she had kept her few remaining possessions from her old life. She took the silver locket from around her neck, its cold weight so familiar against her skin. She opened it one last time, looked at the smiling, confident face of her father, and then she closed it. The click of the clasp, a final, definitive sound. She placed the locket in the box and closed the lid. It was her final act of liberation. That night, they lay together before their fire, its warm golden light flickering on their skin. A profound and knowing tenderness settled between them, a quiet language spoken not with words, but with the soft sounds of breath and the gentle crackle of the hearth. This was the peaceful certainty that follows a storm, a deep and settled calm. He kissed her with a slow, lingering reverence, each touch of his lips a silent promise. His hands moved over her to soothe and reassure, learning the new landscape of her body, which was now irrevocably his. Their closeness was a silent vow, the slow, deliberate building of a life in the small, sacred space of their home. It was firelight and whispered truths, the profound, unshakable intimacy of a shared future. He held her, his arm a comfortable, familiar weight around her, his heartbeat a steady rhythm against her back. And as she drifted off to sleep, safe in the arms of the man who had been her captor, her saviour, her destiny, she finally understood. A home was not 4 walls, but the space carved out in another soul. In the heart of the wild, surrounded by the whispers of the bare moon, she had not been captured, but finally, irrevocably set free.